So on this Earth Day, April 22nd, I'm going to do an environmental movement, basically timeline lecture. I know that we don't study this very much overall and we won't get to it. The AP has included some environmental stuff from time to time, so I want to make sure that you guys at least have an opportunity to get some background. Now, looking back, of course, we can go to the progressive era where we saw people like John Muir and their whole sort of preservationist, like, don't touch anything, versus people like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, who are more multiple use resource management, like, yeah, let's conserve the land, but let's also find ways that people can use it as well. In both cases, they were really trying to keep it away from industry, particularly, logging interests and mining interests who would destroy the land. So we're going to fast forward really to post World War II to really look at the beginnings of the modern environmental movement. And what you really have to consider is, as the automobile becomes incredibly popular, people start to have two cars, maybe even three cars, and then in the mid 50s we have the Federal Highway Act. So we're starting to have to deal with the consequences of that automobile impact. And so we're going to look in 1955, and the reason we're going to start there, it's during Eisenhower's administration. It's actually before he's even done the National Highway Act, but you have the first Air Pollution Control Act. And what's important about this is it's the first piece of legislation to actually look at air pollution in the United States. However, despite the fact that it's supposed to look at air contamination, the act puts regulation largely in the hands of individual states. So it's one of those cases where an act is taken, but it really gives control to the states, and the federal government doesn't do that much. So more than anything, it's sort of a symbolic act and doesn't really give the government all that much control. It's important to think about sort of what else is going on in terms of organizations at that point in time. So in 1956, right, they're still in Eisenhower's era, the Sierra Club membership reaches 10,000 people. Now, the Sierra Club was started by John Muir himself, actually back in 1892, one of the leading organizations caring about natural resources, caring about the environment. And you may say 10,000 people, that's not that many, but at the time, that showed that there was a sizable interest in this organization that will continue to grow, particularly amongst baby boomers, again, those people that are born post-World War II. So we're going to jump to 1962. Now we're in Kennedy's administration, and Congress is going to amend that Air Pollution Control Act that I just talked about from 1955. And the reason it's important is they fund a study conducted by the U.S. Surgeon General to investigate the health effects caused by automobile exhaust. So at this point, there are 74 million cars in the United States. So the reason this is important, now it's starting to really think about, okay, air pollution is a result of automobile, problems. So we're going to start to really isolate the car as one of the culprits. Now, in 1962, we have sort of, again, we have the Bible, or the call to arms of the movement, the Uncle Tom's Cabin, the feminine mystique, and this one is called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And what her claim is that there's an overuse of pesticides, and as a result, birds are dying. So what she says is, looking from 1950 to 1962, the amount of DDT, a certain pesticide, found in actual human tissue has tripled. Now, the chemical industry looks at Carson and they say, this is a distortion of the facts, these are lies. So Kennedy says, okay, let's check it out. And he charges his science advisory committee to look at the book's claims. And then they look at the claims and they say, yeah, they're correct. And then looking forward, by 1972, 10 years later, DDT, this pesticide, will be banned in the United States. Now later, right around the time that Kennedy is actually assassinated in December of 1963, the Clean Air Act. So again, we had pollution, now the Air Pollution Control Act, now we're getting even more specific. The Clean Air Act passes, and it allocates almost $100 million for the study and cleanup of air and water pollution. And it finally gives that federal government, again, moving from the states having the power to the federal government having the power to reduce interstate air pollution. Of course, anything that involves interstate is going to be federal government. Regulate emission standards, that's important, and invest in technologies that will remove sulfur from coal and oil, again, trying to find cleaner energy. Next, we're going to move into LBJ's Great Society. And now an important part of LBJ's Great Society was a focus on the natural environment, along with education and immigration and a war on poverty. Now, in 65, the Water Control Act passes, which gives federal government control over water quality. This is important because they're going to be able to control what states' water quality levels are. Next, you're going to have the Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act, and it sets the automobile emission standards. Again, trying to be able to control what automakers can do so that cars are not emitting as much pollution into the environment. The third one, and this is interesting, is it's the first legislation regarding endangered species. And it gives the Secretary of the Interior, which is a cabinet position, to list endangered domestic fish and wildlife, and basically giving a certain amount of money to protect these species. And not surprisingly, or I guess sadly, the first list of endangered species, which is given out in 1967, will include the American bald eagle, our national symbol, right on there. Okay? Now, it's sort of an odd, trivial piece, but I want to bring it up anyway because I think it's interesting. In late '68, and so this is actually right as LBJ is effectively ending his term. He's got a few more months left. But a guy named Stuart Brand publishes what's known as the Whole Earth Catalog, and it gives a variety of products that help self-sustainable living. Now, actually, there was actually a store when I was growing up called Whole Earth Access, which was all about this. It was super funky granola, and of course my parents shopped there. But what's interesting about this is that this guy, Stuart Brand, will lead basically a back to the land movement that will encourage people to return to organic living. This is in the 60s, certainly in the height of, free love, hippies. So you have rural communes that spring up, and they consist mostly of liberal, educated college students who are trying to live independently off the land. Now, while these communes ultimately will not last, sort of recalling what we saw way back in the antebellum reform era of all these sort of utopian communities, the experiment here does reflect an emerging recognition of environmental issues in the popular culture. And we're heading right into that area about 2 years before Earth Day, where people are really starting to become much more interested sort of in the Earth overall. Now, speaking of the Earth, in late '68, okay, the crew of Apollo 8 takes the first photograph of the Earth from space. I'm sure you've seen it. And that photograph, nicknamed Earthrise, will become the iconic image of the environmental movement. So having that picture of Earth from space actually has a tremendous impact on people being able to sort of conceptualize, wow, this is what we live in, we have to protect it. Now, a really sad moment in the environmental movement, or sort of a need to be focused on the environmental movement, is Ohio's Cuyahoga River, right there in Cleveland, appears to burst into flames when oil and chemicals floating on the surface, cause flames that are like multi-stories high. And so, I mean, when rivers catch on fire because of pollution, people are saying, oh my God, we need to do something. So in December 1969, Gaylord Nelson, who's a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, hires this young guy, 25-year-old guy named Dennis Hayes, to direct a national teach-in about environmental issues. Remember, this is coming out of the civil rights era: sit-ins, wait-ins, lie-ins, pray-ins. All of these, they're going to have a teach-in where people are going to stay in their classrooms and they're going to teach for a very long time about environmental issues. And Hayes, this young guy, recruits a handful of young college graduates to come to D.C. and begin planning for the first Earth Day. So this is the planning piece for what will happen later, months later in 1970. So the 1st of January 1970, Congress passes the National Environmental Policy Act. And you might say, what is this? Well, it's interesting because it requires every federal agency to prepare what's known as an environmental impact statement for any legislation. And what that means is anytime you're going to do anything and you're going to pass anything, you have to know what will it do for the environment. So now they're actually thinking about the impact it would have on Earth when you're passing laws. Now, as they're leading up to Earth Day, which is, again, April 22nd, 1970, today, of course, the anniversary, in the months leading up to Earth Day, advertisements really sort of put out this sort of dire warning. It says it can be the beginning of the end of pollution or the beginning of the end. So what they're saying is either you do something now or we won't have Mother Nature much longer. And again, some opponents condemn this movement for saying, I can't believe that you're doing this right in the middle of the Vietnam War. You're trying to deflect from, the effort to try to end this war or to, make progress. And other people said, well, wait a second. If you look at April 22nd, that's the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birthday. And so this is all a communist plot. Again, really, it was neither, but at the same time, there are plenty of people that weren't happy sort of about this focus on the Earth. Now, on April 22nd, they have the first Earth Day. It's co-chaired by a congressman and then from California, as well as this young guy Dennis Hayes, and it's a nationwide protest against what they called environmental ignorance. And there's an estimation of 20 million people across the country participating in this, and it's going to be the largest demonstration ever in U.S. history. Now, fresh off the heels of this very successful Earth Day, Nixon, who you might not think would be this sort of environmental president, and in some ways he probably wasn't, but there was plenty of environmental progress made during his time, and he actually works with Congress to establish the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a brand new agency that's going to be responsible for United States environmental policy. This is important. Now the federal government has created an agency to look over this, pardon me, and it'll be responsible for passage of environmental legislation, ecological programs, and research. And that's a really huge deal that the federal government is getting itself fully involved. Now, speaking of the federal government, after Earth Day, the same guy, Dennis Hayes, who helped organize it, organizes a movement called the Dirty Dozen. And he's going to choose a list of 12 members of Congress who have infamous records on environmental policy. And they're going to try to make sure these guys don't get reelected in November of 1970. And it will be pretty successful. They're going to actually get rid of 7 of those 12. And they're going to be seen as, hey, you're not good to the environment. Look, these activists will get rid of you. Now, if we're going forward in 72, this is still under Nixon, you have the Clean Water Act. And the importance of this is that they're looking to eliminate toxic substance in water and basically create a national standard of cleanliness. So again, we're working with air, we're working with water. And then speaking of what goes really in the water, but also in the soil, the last day of December 1972, DDT is banned in the United States. And this is a result of a decade of legislative battles that come really out of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And the government had formed investigative panels and looked at all of this. And ultimately, the head of the EPA says at the time, he goes, the continued massive use of DDT posed unacceptable risks to the environment and potential harm to human health. So really to see that Rachel Carson had put this out and 10 years later, might seem like a long time, that the government's doing something in a major way that actually it hurts farmers, because farmers use pesticides to, quote, kill pests, but they're moving towards more of, quote unquote, organic. Now, we're going to jump ahead to Jimmy Carter, okay? Actually, I'm sorry, we're not at Jimmy Carter. We're still going to be actually Nixon into Ford. But there's an Arab oil embargo where they basically say, Arab countries say, we're not going to give you oil. And energy demands exceed supplies in the United States for the first time. Now, there's a real shock here. And the fuel shortage causes gas prices to skyrocket, and the price of oil increases 400%. And the energy crisis fuels immediate research into alternative energy and creates a new dialogue about energy security for the United States. The United States had always assumed we will have oil, and then all of a sudden we feel that we're being held hostage. It's like, wait a second, we need to maybe do something about it, or at least look into it. So now we're going to jump into Jimmy Carter's presidency. And in a televised speech, Carter announces his energy plan. And this is a big deal that a president has an energy plan. And his goal is to lower U.S. energy demand, reduce gasoline consumption, again, coming off 3 years earlier, the oil embargo. And he wants to increase the use of solar energy. And he also proclaims his goals of getting 20% of the nation's energy from renewable energy resources by the year 2000. Okay? So again, he's looking forward over 20 years. And the big deal here is, much like Nixon had created the EPA, President Carter establishes the Department of Energy, which is charged with carrying out a comprehensive national energy plan. And the Department of Energy is going to take accountability for long-term research and technological development, energy regulation, nuclear weapons. And again, this is going to be a cabinet-level office, which is very, very important. Now, we're going to end with one sort of interesting Supreme Court case before we go to the next part of the lecture. But in 1978, the year I was born, the Supreme Court uses the 1973 Endangered Species Act as a reason to stop construction on something called the Tellico Dam in the Tennessee Valley. We remember that, of course. Now, the decision to stop this dam upholds the rights of an endangered species over unrestricted expansion, and it really shows American opposition to dam construction. Now, what I want you to understand is that big construction projects being stopped for an endangered species shows that industry might not get to run rampant. Now, ultimately, some of that is going to be scaled back, as we're going to see later on, but this was a significant moment for the environmental movement.